It is good to be with you again. I hope this moment finds you safe, warm, and quietly listening, wherever you may be. We often talk about the cold of winter outside our doors, the snow, the wind, the endless nights. But what about the cold that settles deep inside the heart after loss and silent years? Have you ever wondered if warmth can return after you have learned how to survive without it? Tonight's story takes us to the frozen city of Duluth, Minnesota, where a withdrawn veteran named Jack lives near the woods with only his German Shepherd. On a night when the storm shows no mercy, he discovers beneath his porch a mother dog and her two puppies, hanging in the freezing dark, abandoned and nearly gone. What follows is not just a rescue from the cold, but an awakening. Stay with me. Subscribe if stories of loyalty and second chances speak to your heart. Let us walk journey together. Winter in Duluth did not fall gently that night. It pressed down hard, wind-driven snow grinding against pine and wood, as if the city itself were being tested for weakness. Jack Miller had learned to live inside weather like this. At 42, his body still carried the squared posture of a soldier, shoulders broad beneath a faded green field jacket, movements economical and quiet. His face was sharply angled, the line of his jaw cut clean beneath a short, untrimmed beard already streaked with premature gray. A thin scar traced the edge of his left eyebrow, a memory from years that refused to stay buried. His steel blue eyes held the permanent distance of a man who had seen too much and learned that survival often meant silence. Jack lived alone in a weather-beaten cabin at the edge of the woods outside Duluth, not because he hated people, but because explaining himself had become harder than isolation. The war had ended for everyone else. For Jack, it had simply grown quieter. His only companion was Shadow, a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a powerful frame and a black and tan coat darkened along the spine like spilled ink. One ear tipped slightly inward from an old injury, and his amber eyes were always alert, thoughtful, listening. Shadow was not aggressive, but he was deeply loyal, the kind of dog that sensed danger before it announced itself. Jack trusted him more than sleep. That night, the storm clawed at the cabin walls like a starving animal. The fire crackled low as Jack sat at the small wooden table, repairing a torn glove with slow, careful stitches. Shadow suddenly rose, his body stiffening, tail dropping low as a quiet growl rolled from his chest. "Easy," Jack murmured, though his pulse had already quickened. He waited, listening. The wind screamed against the roof, and then it came again, thin and fragile, a sound so weak it barely survived the storm. Jack stood, grabbed his flashlight, and opened the door. The cold struck him like a blow, snow whipping into his beard and stinging his eyes. Shadow pressed close behind as Jack swept the beam across the porch. At first, there was nothing. Then the light caught movement. 3 shapes hung beneath the porch beam, swaying slightly in the wind. Jack's breath broke. A German Shepherd mother, her body heavy and slack from recent birth, her fur stiff with ice. Beneath her, tied close, were 2 puppies, tiny and barely weeks old, pressed together with their legs curled inward and their muzzles rimed with frost. Their cries had faded to desperate whispers. Something inside Jack fractured. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clean, silent break that left him hollow. He swore, not in anger but in pain, and dropped to his knees. His fingers fumbled at the rope, numb and shaking, while Shadow stood guard, teeth bared toward the darkness as if daring the storm, or whoever had done this, to return. The knots were tight and deliberate. Jack sliced through the rope, catching the mother dog against his chest as it gave way. She was frighteningly light. The puppies followed, bundled instinctively against her body as Jack pulled them free. "Don't die," Jack whispered hoarsely. "Don't make me watch this again." Inside the cabin, the fire flared as the door slammed shut. Jack laid the mother and puppies near the hearth, stripping off his jacket to wrap them. His hands moved fast but gentle, driven by urgency and memory. Shadow lay beside them, radiating heat, his body a living wall against the cold. One puppy twitched. Another let out a faint whimper. Jack sank back onto his heels, breath ragged, eyes burning. Relief washed over him, followed almost immediately by something darker. His gaze drifted to the rope lying slack on the floor. It was too thick, too cleanly cut, the knots precise. This was not neglect. This was not ignorance. Someone had wanted them dead. Outside, the storm howled on, indifferent and endless. Inside the cabin, something had shifted. The night had not simply delivered victims to Jack's door. It had delivered a truth he could not ignore. The cabin slowly filled with heat, the kind that crept back into frozen wood one breath at a time, never rushing, never promising too much. Jack worked without speaking, laying out old wool blankets near the hearth, warming water on the stove, testing it against his wrist, the way medics once had taught him, when seconds mattered. His hands were steady, but inside him something trembled, a familiar tension that came whenever life hung in the balance. Shadow lay pressed close to the fire, his large body stretched along the floor like a living barrier, amber eyes never leaving the three small forms Jack had pulled from the storm. The mother dog's breathing was rough and uneven, a wet rasp that rattled deep in her chest. Her coat, once thick and proud, lay clumped and stiff from ice, the black and tan dulled to gray under melted snow. Her belly sagged heavy from recent birth, skin loose and marked by strain. Yet even now she angled herself protectively, shifting just enough to shield the two puppies tucked against her ribs. Her eyes were clouded, exhaustion pulling at them. But whenever one of the pups stirred, her ears flicked and her head lifted with stubborn resolve. Jack recognized that look. He had seen it in wounded soldiers who refused evacuation until everyone else was clear. He knelt beside her and spoke softly, more to himself than to the dog. "You're not done yet," he murmured. "I can see that." He dried her legs carefully, rubbing warmth back into muscle that felt frighteningly cold, then moved to the puppies. They were impossibly small, no more than a few pounds each, their bodies all angles and softness, ribs fluttering beneath thin skin. One squirmed constantly, tiny paws twitching as if chasing something only it could see, while the other lay quieter, pressed close to its mother's warmth, eyes barely open, watching the firelight with solemn stillness. Jack found himself smiling before he realized it. The sound that escaped him was soft and unfamiliar, a brief breath of laughter that startled even Shadow, who lifted his head in surprise. Jack shook his own head slowly, almost embarrassed. He hadn't made that sound since before the war, before laughter felt like something borrowed from another life. It lingered for only a second, but it left warmth behind, a strange ache in his chest that was not entirely pain. "You're Ruby," he said quietly to the mother dog, meeting her tired gaze. The name came without effort. Ruby, hard, red, unyielding. She shifted slightly at the sound, as if acknowledging it. He turned to the restless pup. "And your Buddy," he added, watching its clumsy movements, tail twitching even in sleep. Finally, he looked at the quiet one, the puppy whose breathing stayed slow and even, eyes reflecting the fire like pale moonlight. "Luna," he whispered. The name settled gently, fitting the stillness she carried. Shadow crept closer, lowering his head to sniff them, his breath warm and steady. Ruby tensed at first, lips pulling back in a weak warning, but Shadow froze instantly, respectful, then slowly lay down, placing himself just close enough to share his heat. After a moment, Ruby relaxed, her head sinking back to the blanket. Trust, Jack thought. Even now she chose it. As the minutes passed, life returned in small, measurable ways. Buddy let out a thin squeak. Luna's chest rose a little stronger, Ruby's breathing steadied, though each inhale still sounded like work. Jack leaned back against the chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones, the adrenaline finally loosening its grip. He watched the fire and let his mind wander somewhere he usually avoided. Faces surfaced, men he had served with, men who had not come home. He had survived when they hadn't, and the guilt of that survival had settled into him like a second spine, rigid and unforgiving. He had learned to exist quietly around it, to build his days so small that nothing new could be lost. Then Shadow's head snapped up. The dog rose and padded toward the door, nose low, tail stiff. He returned a moment later carrying the end of the rope in his mouth, the same rope Jack had cut through under the porch. Shadow dropped it at Jack's feet and huffed softly, a sound halfway between a warning and a question. Jack stared at it longer this time. The fibers were thick, synthetic, still smelling faintly of oil and metal even after being soaked with snow. He picked it up, running his fingers over the knots, feeling the precise tension in the twists. Too clean. Too practiced. "This wasn't some drunk idiot," Jack said under his breath. His voice had changed, flattened into something colder. The soldier in him stirred, stretching awake after years of forced sleep. He followed the rope with his eyes to Ruby's fur, to the raw marks where it had bitten into her side. Someone had stood there, in the storm, tying those knots with intention. Someone had looked at 3 living beings and decided they were disposable. Jack stood and zipped his jacket slowly, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Shadow watched him closely, recognizing the shift before Jack fully did. "Not tonight," Jack said, glancing back at the fire, at Ruby and the pups breathing in fragile rhythm. "But tomorrow." He returned the rope to the table, laying it flat as if it were evidence. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin the warmth held. Jack knelt once more beside the fire, resting a hand lightly on Shadow's shoulder, then on Ruby's blanket. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. Whatever had been done under his porch had not ended there. At dawn, he would go back outside. Morning came without kindness. The sky over Duluth hung low and gray, the kind of color that flattened the world and erased distance, making everything feel closer and more dangerous at the same time. Fresh snow lay thick across the ground, smooth and deceptive, like a clean page hiding everything written beneath it. Jack moved quietly, shouldering an old canvas backpack worn thin at the edges. Inside were only the essentials: a multi-tool, a flashlight, spare batteries, water, and a compact first aid kit left over from another life. He wore the same faded green jacket, collar turned up against the cold, his beard still rough from a restless night. Shadow walked beside him without command, head level, steps precise, moving with the disciplined calm of a sentry. His paws barely disturbed the snow, ears rotating slowly as he sampled the forest with sound and scent. Beneath the porch, the evidence was clearer in daylight. Jack crouched low, brushing snow aside with his gloved hand. 2 sets of boot prints, large, heavy. The tread was deep and angular, the kind designed for weight and traction, not casual walking. Military-style soles, spaced wide, moving with purpose. There were drag marks too, faint but unmistakable, lines cut through the snow where something heavy had been hauled toward the trees. Jack's jaw tightened. Whoever had been here hadn't panicked. They had worked efficiently. Shadow sniffed along the beam, then stopped abruptly, nose pressed to the wood. He let out a short, sharp huff. Jack followed his gaze and spotted it. A length of rope partially buried near the foundation, freshly cut. He lifted it carefully. Synthetic, thick, the same kind as the night before. A strip of black tape clung to it, stiff with cold, strands of coarse dog hair stuck fast. Jack slipped both into his pocket. His pulse slowed, sharpening into focus. This wasn't random cruelty. This was procedure. They followed the tracks into the trees. The forest closed around them, pines tall and bare, their branches creaking softly under the weight of snow. The farther Jack walked, the quieter the world became, the silence dense enough to press against his ears. Shadow ranged slightly ahead now, stopping often, checking back, waiting for Jack before moving on. The tracks led downhill, toward a shallow valley hidden between ridges. That was when Jack heard it. Not wind, not branches. Dogs. Many of them. Low sounds at first. Broken whines, muffled barks, the kind that came from throats tired of making noise no one answered. Jack slowed, raising a hand. Shadow froze instantly, muscles coiled. Through the trees, a cluster of wooden sheds came into view, thrown together without care. Roofs sagging, walls patched with mismatched boards. A generator hummed nearby, its mechanical growl foreign and wrong in the quiet woods. Jack crouched behind a fallen log and eased forward. Snow dusted his beard as he leaned toward a narrow gap in one shed's wall. Inside, the air was dim and foul. Cages lined the interior, stacked too high, packed too close. Dogs pressed against metal bars. German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, some young, some fully grown. Their coats were dull, eyes hollow with fear and confusion. None of them looked aggressive. They looked broken. Two men stood near a folding table cluttered with paperwork and tools. The taller one was broad and thick-necked, head shaved down to stubble, his face blunt and heavy like it had been carved rather than shaped. A jagged scar cut across his knuckles, and his movements were impatient, careless. The second man was shorter, stockier, with a graying beard that looked unwashed and uneven, his eyes narrow and calculating. He moved with practiced ease, checking locks, kicking one cage when a dog growled too loudly. "They won't last long like this," the taller man muttered. "Doesn't matter," the bearded one replied. "Buyers don't care how they start, only what they become." Jack's stomach turned. He raised his phone slowly and began recording through the crack, steadying his hands against the wood. Faces, voices, cages, the generator's serial number. He caught it all. Each detail burned into his focus. Shadow stayed silent beside him, body vibrating with restrained tension, eyes fixed on the men. Then a branch snapped. The sound was sharp and final. "Hey!" a voice barked. "You hear that?" Flashlight beams slashed through the trees like blades. Jack didn't think. He moved. Shadow bolted first, leading them downhill through deep snow, weaving between trunks with instinctive precision. Jack followed, lungs burning, boots slipping, the world reduced to white blur and breath. A shout echoed behind them. Then the crack of a gunshot split the air. Snow exploded near Jack's feet. Another shot followed, splintering bark inches from his shoulder. They ran harder. Shadow veered sharply toward a narrow ravine, leaping it cleanly. Jack barely cleared it, landing hard, pain flashing up his leg, but he didn't slow. The forest swallowed them, sound fading, gunfire dissolving into distance. By the time they reached the outer edge of the woods, Jack's chest felt like it was on fire. He dropped to one knee, hand braced against the snow, Shadow circling back immediately, nose pressed to Jack's face as if counting breaths. Jack exhaled slowly and checked his phone. The recording was still there. "Good," he muttered. "Good boy." They made their way back toward the cabin carefully, choosing a longer route, avoiding open ground. As the roofline finally came into view through the trees, relief flickered briefly, then hardened into something else entirely. Jack looked at the smoke rising faintly from his chimney and thought of Ruby, of Buddy and Luna curled by the fire, of how easy it would be to hurt what could not run. He reached the porch and paused, scanning the woods one last time. Whoever those men were, they now knew someone was watching, and they would not leave loose ends. Jack stepped inside, locking the door behind him, already planning his next move. The storm returned as if Duluth itself resented the idea of a man beginning to thaw. Snow fell heavier than before, driven sideways by wind that screamed through the pines, rattling the cabin like a warning meant to be understood. Jack felt it long before the first knock, felt it in the tightness of his chest, in the way Shadow refused to lie down, in the uneasy stillness that wrapped the woods too neatly. Jack moved with quiet purpose. He secured the door with an old iron bar, pulled a heavy dresser across the weakest window, and killed every light except the fire. Not because he intended to play the hero, but because he had learned, painfully, that hesitation cost lives. Ruby lay near the hearth, her breathing shallow but steady, her body curved protectively around Buddy and Luna. Her eyes followed Jack's movements, dark and alert despite her weakness, as if she understood more than fear, understood stakes. Shadow took position near the door, his body rigid, muscles bunched beneath his coat, teeth barely visible behind curled lips. He did not bark. He waited. The knock came hard, wood shuddering under the impact. "Open up!" The voice was rough, male, edged with impatience rather than uncertainty. Jack didn't move. He listened instead, counting breaths, spacing footsteps. There was more than one man out there. Snow crunched slowly around the cabin, deliberate circles tightening. They were not drunk. They were not panicked. They were hunting for something they believed already belonged to them. "Give us the phone," another voice called, closer to the window now. "Give us the evidence and we walk away." Jack's jaw clenched. He reached into his pocket and unlocked his phone, hands steady despite the hammering of his pulse. He sent the video file, every second of it, to the only person in town he trusted, without question. Susan Bennett. Susan was in her late 60s, short and compact, with iron-gray hair always pinned back neatly and skin weathered by years of flower dust and winter wind. She owned the bakery on West Superior Street, a narrow place that smelled perpetually of yeast, cinnamon, and warmth. Her voice was soft, almost maternal, but her eyes missed nothing. She had lost her husband, a volunteer firefighter, 20 years earlier in a warehouse blaze, and grief had sharpened her rather than broken her. When Susan paid attention to something, it mattered. Outside, the storm swallowed sound, but Jack knew time was thin. The door exploded inward with a violent crack, splinters flying as cold air and snow burst into the cabin. Two men rushed in. One was tall and broad, shotgun raised, his face half hidden beneath a scarf, eyes wild with frustration. The other was leaner, older, wielding a crowbar with a grip too familiar to be clumsy. Shadow launched forward like a released arrow. The impact knocked the man with the crowbar off balance, Shadow's weight slamming into him as Jack moved at the same instant. Jack struck the man with the shotgun, driving his shoulder into the attacker's ribs. Pain flared sharp and hot along Jack's upper arm as the shotgun discharged into the ceiling, wood exploding overhead. He ignored it. Training took over. Close distance, control the weapon, breathe. Chaos filled the cabin. Ruby growled weakly from the hearth, pulling her body tighter around her pups. Buddy squealed. Luna went silent. Jack drove his elbow into the shotgun wielder's throat and felt the man collapse. Before the second attacker could recover, Shadow was on him again, teeth snapping inches from skin, forcing him back toward the doorway. The man shouted, slipping in the snow just as the sound cut through the storm. Sirens. At first they sounded like wind. Then they grew louder, undeniable, rising through the white chaos like a promise. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, reflecting off snow and glass. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Sheriff Tom Keller stepped through the shattered doorway moments later, snow clinging to his long brown coat. Keller was in his mid-50s, tall and square-built, with a weathered face and graying hair cut short in the manner of men who never fully leave uniform behind. His voice was calm, practiced, the kind that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. 2 deputies followed, moving fast, efficient, weapons trained. The attackers froze. Cuffs snapped closed. They were dragged out into the storm, cursing, boots slipping as they vanished into the swirl of snow and light. Jack sagged slightly against the wall, breath coming hard. Shadow returned to him immediately, pressing his head into Jack's thigh, checking, grounding. Jack rested a shaking hand on the dog's neck and looked toward the fire. Ruby lifted her head. Her eyes met his. She didn't whine. She didn't panic. She simply watched him, and in that look was something unmistakable. Acknowledgement. "You're safe," Jack whispered. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to her or to himself. Susan arrived soon after, bundled in a thick wool coat, cheeks flushed from cold and fear. When she saw Jack standing, bleeding but alive, her shoulders sagged with relief. She crossed the room without hesitation and touched his arm gently, fingers warm and steady. "You didn't face them alone," she said quietly. Jack nodded, emotion tightening his throat too much for words. As the deputies secured the scene, Jack looked around his cabin, at the broken door, the fire still burning, the 3 fragile lives breathing in fragile rhythm, and something settled into place inside him. For the first time in years, he understood it clearly. He was no longer fighting by himself. Winter loosened its grip without ceremony. The snow that had once buried roads and memories softened into narrow streams that caught the sunlight and shimmered like quiet apologies. Duluth breathed again. Pines dripped steadily, roofs shed their white armor, and the world seemed to remember how to move forward. Ruby recovered slowly but stubbornly. Her coat regained its sheen in uneven patches, the deep black and warm tan returning like color to a faded photograph. The scars where the rope had bitten into her skin healed last, leaving pale reminders she carried without complaint. She walked with care at first, favoring one hind leg, but her posture changed day by day, from guarded to upright, from survival to vigilance. Buddy and Luna grew faster than Jack expected. Their legs stretched too long for their bodies, turning every run into a clumsy celebration of momentum. Buddy barreled forward with reckless joy, tripping over his own paws, and tumbling into snowbanks. He insisted on attacking again. Luna followed more cautiously, quieter, her eyes always tracking movement before joining in, as if learning the world by watching it breathe. Shadow observed it all from a distance. At 6 years old now, his muzzle beginning to gray, he carried himself with the dignified patience of an older brother who pretended indifference while counting every breath. He corrected Buddy with gentle nudges, stood between Luna and danger without being asked, and yet betrayed himself constantly with a wagging tail whenever the pups collapsed against him for warmth. Susan Bennett came by often, sometimes with bread, sometimes with nothing but conversation. She stood in the doorway one morning, hands tucked into the pockets of her wool coat, eyes sweeping the yard where dogs now moved freely. "You know," she said, voice thoughtful, "this place doesn't feel lonely anymore." Susan had always been small, her back slightly curved from years of bending over ovens, but there was a steadiness in her stance that suggested unshakable resolve. Loss had not made her bitter. It had sharpened her compassion. The idea formed without effort. It felt less like invention and more like recognition. "We should build something here," Susan said, as if finishing a sentence already started. "Not just for them." She nodded toward Ruby and the pups. "For people too. The ones who don't know where to go after the cold." Word spread through the town quietly. No flyers, no speeches, just neighbors showing up with gloves, lumber, old fencing pulled from barns. One of them was Sarah Whitman, a woman in her late 30s with auburn hair worn loose down her back and pale, freckled skin that burned easily in the sun. She was tall and lean, her movements careful but strong, the kind of strength earned through responsibility rather than effort. Sarah had lost her husband to illness the previous winter and had learned how to carry grief without letting it hollow her out. She worked without complaint, sleeves rolled up, smile soft but reserved, speaking gently to the dogs as if they understood more than words. Jack watched it all with quiet disbelief. He found himself teaching without realizing it, showing volunteers how to approach frightened dogs, how to kneel instead of loom, how to let trust come on its own terms. He trained Buddy and Luna alongside older strays brought in from nearby roads, teaching them simple commands not for obedience, but for confidence. Shadow supervised everything, correcting when needed, approving when deserved. They named the place simply, North Star Haven. The sign was hand-carved, the letters imperfect but honest, hung just outside the cabin where storms had once brought fear. Now it caught the sun. The opening night came softly. Lanterns were lit across the yard, their warm glow trembling in the dusk. Children laughed. Dogs barked. Susan's apple bread disappeared faster than it could be sliced. Ruby lay beside Jack on the porch, her body relaxed, eyes half closed. Buddy and Luna raced in uneven circles, chasing nothing and everything, while Shadow rested his head on his paws, eyes bright, watching the world he had helped protect. Jack looked up at the sky. Stars burned cold and clear above Duluth, the same stars he had once stared at from distant deserts, wondering if he would ever feel anchored again. He swallowed, emotion rising unexpectedly, and spoke quietly. Not to the crowd, not even to Susan, but to the night itself. "Maybe I didn't come back to disappear," he said. "Maybe I came back to keep the door open." No one applauded. No one needed to. The light remained. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, fire, or voices from the sky. Sometimes they arrive quietly, wrapped in fur, carried by cold nights, and placed gently at our door when we least expect them. In this story, no angel descended, yet grace still found its way through the storm, through a wounded man who chose not to turn away, through a mother dog who refused to release her pups, and through a small town that decided light was worth protecting. Perhaps God does not always remove the winter from our lives, but He walks with us through it, offering just enough warmth to take the next step. If you are listening tonight and carrying your own silent cold, remember this: it is never too late to open the door again. Love, faith, and purpose often return in the smallest forms, asking only that we notice. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a reminder that hope still finds its way home. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or what this story stirred within you. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, second chances, and quiet miracles. And wherever you are, may God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm in both body and spirit.